Reading Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. Preface by Pat Conroy, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and Chicago Tribune. In praise of the book writes, a book that will not be forgotten. So here we go, we're just going to read from here about the author. Born in Atlanta, Georgia on November 8, 1900, Margaret Mitchell spent her childhood listening to the war stories. So about the author, we just said that she spent her childhood listening to the war stories of Confederate veterans. They told her everything about the Civil War except that the South had lost. She found that out when she was 10 years old. Before leaving for Smith College in 1918, Mitchell fell in love with Lieutenant Clifford Henry, a Harvard undergraduate training for active duty in World War I at Camp Gordon in Atlanta. In 1919, shortly after she learned that Henry had been killed in France, her mother became ill and Margaret rushed home. She did not make it in time to see her mother, and she stayed on to care for her father and brother. Mitchell had many stories, but Red Upshaw and John Marsh came to the fore as serious potential husbands. She got a job as the first woman to cover hard news from the Atlanta Journal and married Upshaw. The marriage was short. Upshaw was a bootlegger and an alcoholic. John Marsh, her other serious suitor, returned. They married and remained so until her death. Mitchell was forced to quit her job at the Atlanta Journal because of problems with her ankles and feet. Bedridden, she read voraciously and began work on what her friends called the great American novel. She showed the finished manuscript, all 1,037 pages of it, to a visiting New York publisher, and on June 10, 1936, Gone with the Wind was published. It says continued on the inside back cover. Let me read. By October of that year, Gone with the Wind had sold 1 million copies, and David O. Selznick bought the rights for $50,000. At the time, it was the highest price ever paid by Hollywood for the rights to a first novel. Margaret Mitchell won the Pulitzer Prize in 1937, and in 1939, Atlanta hosted the premiere of one of the most popular movies of all time, Gone with the Wind, starring Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh. On August 11, 1949, while crossing Peachtree and 13th Street close to her home, Margaret Mitchell was struck by an off-duty cab driver and died 5 days later. She was buried in Atlanta's Oakland Cemetery with the rest of her family. Many years earlier, in an interview with her publisher, she was asked what Gone with the Wind was about. She said, "If the novel has a theme, it is that of survival. What makes some people come through catastrophes and others apparently just as able, strong and brave go under. It happens in every upheaval. Some people survive, others don't. What qualities in those who fight their way through triumphantly that are lacking in those that go under? I only know that survivors used to call that quality gumption, so I wrote about people who had gumption and people who didn't." 1936. In praise of the book, the New York Times says, "Beyond a doubt, one of the most remarkable first novels produced by an American writer. It is also one of the best." And the Washington Post, what does it have to say? It says, "The best novel to have ever come out of the South is unsurpassed in the whole of American writing." And talking about Chicago Tribune, What does it have to say? It says, fascinating and unforgettable, a remarkable book, a spectacular book, a book that will not be forgotten. And the New Yorker, for sheer readability, I can think of nothing it must give way before Miss Mitchell proves herself a staggeringly gifted storyteller. It's a pocketbook edition, and here are all the rules and regulations about copyright, etc. It's by MacMillan Publishing Company, and the pocketbook edition June 2008, etc. And these are the ISBN numbers for you to know. Let me read something from the preface by Pat Conroy. The novel Gone with the Wind shaped the South I grew up in most than any other book he writes. For the most part, it was raised in a house without... He says, for the most part, I was raised in a house without books, but the ones displayed and laid out flat for the inspection of the visitors were the Bible and Gone with the Wind, in no particular order of importance. My mother bought countless numbers of novels during my childhood to hand out as gifts or to replace the ones she read so frequently that they came apart in her hands. Few white Southerners even today can read this book without conjuring up a complex, tortured dreamscape of the South, handed down by generations of relatives who grew up with a taste of defeat, like the blowing of gunmetal still in their mouths. What Margaret Mitchell got so perfectly was a sense of irredeemable loss and of a backwater Camelot corrupted by the mannerless intrusions of insensate invaders. The Tara invoked in the early chapters of this book is a mirror of southern utopia, a party at 12 Oaks that might have gone on forever if the hot-blooded boys of the South could have stemmed the passions of secession and held their fire at Fort Sumter. It is the South as an occupied nation that forms the heart of this not impartial novel. This is the Iliad of Southern accent, burning with the humiliation of Reconstruction. It is the song of the fallen, unregenerate Troy, the one sung in lower key by the women who had to pick up the pieces of a fractured society when their sons and husbands returned with their causes in their throats. When the final battle cry was sounded, it is a story of war told by the women who did not lose it and who refused to believe in its results long after the occupation had begun. According to Margaret Mitchell, the Civil War destroyed a civilization of unsurpassable amenity, chivalry, and grace. To Southerners like my mother, Gone with the Wind was not just a book. It was an answer, a clenched fist raised to the North, an anthem of defiance. If you could not defeat the Yankees on the battlefield, then by God, one of your women could rise from the ashes of humiliation to write more powerfully than the enemy and all the historians and novelists who sang the praises of the Union. The novel was published in 1936, and it still stands as the last great posthumous victory of the Confederacy. It will long be a favorite book of any country that ever lost a war. It is still the most successful novel ever published in our republic. Gone with the Wind is as controversial a novel as it is magnificent. Even during its publication year, when Margaret Mitchell won a Pulitzer Prize, the book attracted a glittering array of literary critics, including Malcolm Corley, the Bernard D. Watteau, who attacked the artistry and politics of the novel with a ferocity that continues to this day. Margaret Mitchell was a partisan of the first rank, and there never has been a defense of the plantation South so implacable in its cold righteousness or its resolute belief that the wrong side had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. In this novel, the moral weight of the narrative is solidly and iconoclastically in line with the Gospel according to the Confederate States. It stands in furious counterpoint to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book that Margaret Mitchell ridicules on several occasions by scoffing the Stowe's famous scene of bloodhounds pursuing runaway slaves across ice floes. Margaret Mitchell writes to the Confederacy as paradise. As the ruined garden looked back upon by a stricken and exiled Eve, disconsolate with loss. If every nation deserves its own defense and its own day in the sunshine of literature, then Margaret Mitchell rose to the task of playing the avenging angel for the Confederate States. Okay, Gone with the Wind is a war novel, a historical romance, a comedy of manners, a bitter lamentation of cry of the heart, and a long, cold-hearted look at the character of this one lovely MacMillan southern woman. The book is sure-footed and beautifully constructed into fine, swiftly moving parts and 63 chapters. Margaret Mitchell possessed a playwright's ear for dialogue, and the reader never becomes confused as the hundreds of characters move in and out of the scenes throughout the book. She grants each character the clear imprimatur of a unique and completely distinct voice. Once Miss Mitchell has limned the outlines of the main characters, live completely and eternally in the imagination of the reader. She was born to be a novelist, but one of that rare hybrid breed who bloom but once on the American landscape, then withdraw into their own interiors, having given voice to the one novel bursting along the seams of consciousness. Margaret Mitchell sings her own song of a land-proud, war-damaged South, and her voice is operatic, biblical, epic. Her genius lay in her choice of locale and point of focus and heroine. She leaves the great battlefields of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Bull Run and Antietam to the others, and the places of civil war in the middle of Scarlett O'Hara's living room. She has a northern cannon sounding beyond Peachtree Creek as Melanie Wilkes goes into labor, and has the city of Atlanta in flames as Scarlett is seized with an overpowering urge to return home that finds her moving down Peachtree streets with the world she grew up in turning to ash around her. The novel begins and ends with Tara, but it is Scarlett herself who represents the unimaginable changes that the war has wrought on all Southerners. It was in Southern women that the deep hatred the war engendered came to nest for real in the years of Reconstruction. The women of South became the only American women to know the hard truths of war firsthand. They went hungry just as their men did on the front lines in Virginia and Tennessee. They starved when these men failed to come home for 4 straight growing seasons, and hunger was an old story when the war finally ended. The men of Chancellorsville, Franklin, and Wilderness seem to have left some residue of fury in the smoking, blood-drenched fields and battles, whose very names became sacred in the retelling. But Southern women, forced to live with their defeat, had to build granaries around the heart to store the poison that the glands of rage produced during the war and its aftermath. The Civil War still feels personal in the South, and what the women of the South brought to peacetime was Scarlett O'Hara's sharp memory of exactly what they had lost. With the introduction of Scarlett O'Hara and Red Butler, Miss Mitchell managed to create the two most famous lovers in the English-speaking world since Romeo and Juliet. Scarlett springs alive in the first sentence of the book and holds the narrative center for over 1,000 pages. She's fabulous, pixelated, one-of-a-kind creation, and she does not utter a dull line in the entire book. She makes her uncontrollable self-centeredness seem like the most charming thing in the whole world, and one feels she would be more than a match for Anna Karenina, Lady Macbeth, or any of the women of Tennessee Williams. Her entire nature shines with the joy of being pretty and sought after and frivolous in the first chapters, and we see her character darkening slowly throughout the book. She rises to meet challenge after challenge as the war destroys the entire world. She was born into a daughter of the South. Tara made her charming, but the war made her Scarlett O'Hara. The cynicism of Red Butler is still breathtaking to read about, and his black-hearted, impudent humor resonates throughout the book. He serves as a clarifying eye in the midst of so many high-toned language, speaking of the cause and the Southern way of life. His is the first sounding of the New South, rising of the chaos left in the passing of the old order, yet in the arc of his character it is Rhett, and Rhett alone, who seems to change most dramatically in this book. He who never let an opportunity pass in order to mock the pieties and abstractions of Southern patriotism joined the Confederate Army only when its defeat was certain. Red Butler, who profoundly greatly, while blockade running, food speculating, and bankrolling prostitutes, turns out the softest of fathers, the most self-sacrificing of friends, and the most flamboyant and ardent of lovers. Yet it is his wounded masculinity that haunts the book as a secret toll the war took on the South. His one great flaw was making the terrible and the exhilarating mistake of falling in love with Scarlett O'Hara. Both Scarlett and Red are perfect representatives of the type of Southerner who prospered amidst the ruins of a conquered nation. They both collaborated with the occupying army, both prospered by embracing pragmatism and eschewing honor. Red and Scarlett are the two characters in the book who let you know what the Southern will become. Ashley Wilkes and Melanie Hamilton let you know what the South was and will never be again. The practicality of both Red and Scarlett make them the spiritual parents of Atlanta, born of fire. Atlanta was the first Southern city to fall in love with a party of hustle and progress. The burning of Atlanta increased the city's lack of roots and made it even more like Dayton than Charleston. Red and Scarlett were masterful at cutting deals and playing the percentages and not looking back. They bequeathed these gifts to the reborn city itself. Skipping a few pages and continuing reading, it says, Gone with the Wind presented my mother and people like her with a new sense of themselves. She hailed the book as the greatest book ever written or that ever would be written, a non-parallel that restored the Southerner's sense of honor to itself after the unimaginable hours of war and occupation. I have come across legions of critics that deplored my mother's taste in fiction, but this was my mother, and I was heir to that taste for better or worse. My mother's hurt childhood had damaged something irreparable in her sense of self, and I think she won back by her obsessive identification with Scarlett O'Hara. My mother's family suffered grievously during the Depression, but Scarlett taught her that one could be hungry and despairing, but not broken and not without resource, spiritual in nature that precluded one from surrendering without a fight. When Scarlett swears to God after rooting around for that radish in the undone garden of Tara, that she will never go hungry again. She was giving voice to every American who had suffered want and fear during the Hoover years. It was this same Scarlett who gave Southern women like my mother, new insights into the secrecies and potentials of womanhood itself, not always apparent in that region of the country where the progress of women moves most slowly. Gone with the Wind tells the whole story of a lost society through the eyes of a single woman, and that woman proves match enough for a world at war, an army of occupation, and every man who enters those sugared realms of our attraction rarely has a heroine so immoral or unscrupulous as Scarlett O'Hara held the deed of center stage during the course of such a long novel. Whenever the movie version was released again by MGM, my mother would march all her children to the local theater with a sense of religious anticipation. I remember that feeling of participating in some rite of sacred mystery when the movie began and my mother let herself be taken once again by the singular canonical movement in Southern myth-making. She would hum along when the theme from Tara began playing, and she would be at all the right places. I would observe my mother watching her heroine, Scarlett O'Hara, my mother mouthing the words as Scarlett spoke them to Ashley, to Red, to Melanie, to Yankee, and to Loper, who desecrated the sanctuary of Tara, and I would be thinking what I think now, that my mother was as pretty as Scarlett O'Hara, that she had modeled herself completely on this fictional creation and had done so as an act of sheer will and homage. I would wonder if anyone else in the theater could see what she was perfectly obvious to me, that this movie belonged to my mother, and that it was a site of her own invention of herself, the place where she came to revive her own deepest dream of a lost girlhood. The movie version of Gone with the Wind, like the book, was a house of worship my mother retired to so she could experience again the spiritual refreshment of art. Yet it is as a work of art that Gone with the Wind has been most suspect. From the beginning, the book has endured the incoming fire of some of the nation's best critics. It is a book of Dickensian power written after the dawn of the Age of Ulysses. Its vigorous defense of the Confederacy was published 3 years before the German Panzer divisions rolled across the borders to Poland. In the structure of Margaret Mitchell's perfect society, slavery was an essential part of the unity and harmony of the Southern life before the Fort Sumter. No black man or woman can read this book and be sorry that this particular wind has gone. The Ku Klux Klan plays the same romanticized role it had in Birth of a Nation, and appears to be a benign combination of the Elks Club and a men's equestrian society. Liberal critics took the novel apart from the beginning, then watched it as it proceeded to become the best-selling book in American history. Its flaws may have doomed a lesser book, but this one rode out into literary history with Red and Scarlett in complete command of the carriage. Literature, he writes, often has a soft spot for the lost cause. Defeat lends an air of tragedy and nostalgia that the victors find unnecessary, but history will forgive almost anything except being outwritten. None can explain the devotion that Gone with the Wind has inspired from one generation to another, but one cannot let this ardor go unremarked upon either, because its readers have held it in such high esteem that it has cheapened the book's reputation as a work of art. Democracy works because of the will of the people, but it has the opposite effect when scholars begin to call out those books that make up the canon of our nation's literature. Gone with the Wind has outlived a legion of critics and will bury another whole set of them after this century closes, he writes. And I've come to the last page here. I'm going to read from here what Pat has to say. Gone with the Wind works because it possesses the inexpressible magic where the art of pure storytelling rises above its ancient use and succeeds in explaining to a whole nation how it came to be this way. There has never been a reader or writer who could figure out why this happens. Only a few, very few books. It involves all the eerie mysteries of enchantment itself, the strange, untouchable wizardry that occurs when a story, in all its fragile elegance, speaks to the times in a clear, original voice and answers some strange hungers and demands of the zeitgeist. I know of no other 1,000-page book that reads so swiftly and grants such pleasure. The characters are wonderful and the story moves with swiftness and bright, inexorable power. The novel allows you to lose yourself in the glorious pleasures of reading itself when all five senses ignite in the sheer happiness of narrative. The Civil War and its aftermath may not have felt like this at all, but it sure seems that way when one gets carried away in the irresistible tumult and surge of Gone with the Wind. This book caught the imagination of Americans and the world as few books ever have or ever will. It demonstrates again and again that there is no passion more rewarding than reading itself, that it remains the best way to dream and to feel the sheer carnal joy of being fully and openly alive. Gone with the Wind is a book with many flaws, but it cannot even now be easily put down. The book still glows and quivers with life. American letters will always be tiptoeing nervously around that room where Scarlett O'Hara dresses for the party at 12 Oaks as the war between the states begins to inch its way towards ta-da. What a wonderful preface. Look at that book, paperback, Gone with the Wind. The back cover. It writes, many novels have been written about the Civil War and its aftermath. None takes us into the burning fields and cities of the American South as Gone with the Wind does, creating haunting scenes and thrilling portraits of characters so vivid that we remember their words and feel their fear and hunger for the rest of our lives. The inimitable Scarlett O'Hara and Red Butler, Margaret Mitchell, not only conveyed a timeless story of survival under the harshest of circumstances, she also created the two most famous lovers in the English-speaking world since Romeo and Juliet. And it's written that Margaret Mitchell sings her own song of a land proud, war damaged South, and her voice is operatic, biblical, epic, writes Pat Conroy, author of The Prince of Tides. This is I've read it twice, once long back and then recently, and really, I mean, it is so interesting. The flow is so the flow of language and the imagery is so rich. It's so vivid. You almost feel that you're watching a movie. Gone with the Wind.